Welcome to the last thinking space for semester 2 of 2021. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining this meeting today, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land wherever you might be joining this meeting today. Today we have, our speaker is Leilani Craig. She'll be presenting on equality and equity in disaster risk reduction processes and practices for deaf communities, which is there on the screen. So won't waste any more time. I'll hand it over to Leilani. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here today. I'd like to firstly thank Bob and James for giving me this opportunity to present some preliminary results from my PhD research, focusing on disaster justice, equality versus equity in disaster risk reduction, commonly known as DRR, processes and practices for deaf communities. I'd also like to mention that you might see that I have be able to see through my eye gaze that I have two screens. If you want to ask a question or interrupt, I'll need to look at my other screen versus what you're seeing now on the Zoom webinar. So if you see my eyes change, it's just because I need to look at the interpreter on the other screen. All right. So thank you again. And I'll now start my presentation properly. So this is a quick recap of my research, which identifies the specific roles that deaf organisations can play in supporting deaf, hard of hearing and deaf-blind people in DRR, their ability to respond and capacity to assist during and post-disasters. There have been cases of successful interventions that have been culturally sensitive and designed to increase deaf communities' resilience to natural disasters and hazards around the world. However, many initiatives are difficult to sustain and may have negative consequences on DRR-related service provisions and community trust and engagement. Whilst interventions may not be automatic or immediate, there are times when initiatives either cease or become dormant for a period of time. My research will focus on why this is the case and what can be done to improve the sustainability of successful preparedness and response initiatives that support the deaf community. I would also like to mention that I started this research as an MPhil student. And that was until a few months ago when I upgraded to a PhD. So the current research is more involved than what I had originally planned. All right, if we now look at aims, there are 3 aims that I'm hoping to achieve by the end of my research. Firstly, what past support has been available to deaf communities in responding to and recovering from natural hazards and pandemic disasters? Secondly, what roles, if any, that deaf support organisations have had in assisting deaf, hard of hearing and deaf-blind people affected by disasters? And finally, examples of best practices that have worked well that can be modelled for others to follow. Now, if we look at background and context, people with disabilities are often at higher risk for being affected by disasters. UNESCAP in 2017 found that people with disabilities are 4 times more likely to die than those without disabilities. This is critical because why is it the case? And what does the research say about this? Naoki did some research on the death rates, looking at 5 different disability groups during the 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami. And that research looked at 5 disability groups. Firstly, those with physical disabilities, those that were blind or with low vision, deaf or hard of hearing people, those with mental health issues, and finally, those with intellectual disabilities. Out of the 5 groups, deaf people had the highest death rates compared with other groups. Okay, it's understandable that this has been researched in Japan, but it's worth exploring whether this is also the case for other parts of the world as well. Furthermore, the first research that documented the experiences of deaf and hard of hearing people and disasters in 2003 cited, in inverted commas, poor information dissemination as one of the main reasons for being ill-prepared for weather-related disasters. Unfortunately, 18 years later, not much has changed. So the reasons for this are as follows. The problem is not because deaf and hard of hearing people can't hear per se, but it is the system that creates barriers. The lack of access to emergency information, access to support such as interpreters and services that deaf community members affected by disasters need, whether that be medical needs or for shelter or for food. Without proper access to emergency information and services, this heightens their risks in terms of disasters. So my research questions are looking at a few things, really 2 things. There have been, as I mentioned, a few successful interventions tried already on increasing the resilience of deaf communities around the world that involved 3 things. Firstly, the deaf community and its networks, which were more effective in meeting deaf communities' needs than organised relief agencies during Hurricanes Katrina and also Rita in America. Secondly, the Japanese Federation of the Deaf, commonly known as JFD, and the Japanese Association of Social Workers for Deaf and Hard of Hearing People work together to provide a safe space and group for deaf and hard of hearing victims traumatised from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that local government administrations were not able to meet. And thirdly, there was the Get Ready Deaf Community New South Wales project. It was an initiative that trained deaf and hard of hearing people in becoming deaf liaison officers, who then serve as a communication bridge between emergency services and the deaf community on emergency information and services. Despite these initiatives, there is still continually high risk experienced by deaf people in terms of disasters triggered by natural hazards and pandemics. And secondly, what kind of challenges and barriers are there in sustaining initiatives supporting deaf communities' resilience to disasters? So, research focuses on the Asian and Pacific regions with some case studies shared from other countries overseas. However, the presentation today will focus on Australia. Based on the information that I've collected from deaf organisations, key informants, and emergency service agencies, there appears to be a gap on understanding equality and equity from both sides. It's really about international and national agencies and DRR policies that Australia has signed and supported, and how this applies to deaf communities in relation to disasters. Now I'd like to talk about DRR policies. The first is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, commonly known as the UNCRPD. This highlights the human rights of people with disabilities in their everyday life. Included in the UNCRPD is Article 11, which focuses on situations, on risks and humanitarian emergencies. This basically means making sure that people with disabilities are properly protected when there are risky situations for everybody, such as during disasters triggered by natural hazards and human effects. Then we have the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction. And that was promulgated from between 2015 and 2030. And it's another UN policy that focuses specifically on DRR. This framework also advocates for stronger inclusion of people with disabilities in all DRR planning. Next, there is national and local disability laws and policies. However, these are really open for interpretation when it comes to accessing emergency information. The problem is that there are some laws and policies that are clear and transparent, especially between national and local governments, but others are more vague or outdated. This is especially the case where it remains unclear on how people with disabilities are supported on national and at national and local levels during disasters. For example, whose responsibility is it to fund and support access costs? Is it the local or national government? Now, while many governments have signed and supported national and international disability and DRR policies, what we see is a need to consider people with disabilities in their country as progressive, and sometimes it is. The actual practice is not easy to implement. In Australia, the government has signed the UNCRPD, the Sendai Framework, and passed the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992, known by its acronym, the DDA, all of which have at least something that covers people with disabilities and emergencies. However, there are disconnects on how Australia supports these international and national policies to emergency service agencies, deaf organisations, and key informants. So my research actually looked at that, and what it found was that 87% combined were aware of the DDA. However, no one knew whether the DDA covered emergencies. 63% combined were aware of the UNCRPD. However, 0% combined were aware of the Sendai Framework. So the reasons for these disconnects are due to the following. There's a number of them. One is to do with increasing the resilience for people with disabilities, and that remains mainly policy-centred between UN agencies and national governments, with less attention on local governments, emergency service agencies, disability organisations, and on field or ground interventions at the local level. There's a real disconnect there. Some emergency services agencies' practices are largely top-down and exclusionary, which means that emergency management agencies think that they know best or what is best for people with disabilities, but they actually don't consult them on what their needs are, which excludes those people from any emergency planning processes. This has led to disconnects between disability groups and emergency service agencies, where both groups do not have a lot of knowledge or skills about each other. Then there are cultural factors and attitudes. There are different working cultural practices and perceptions about people with disabilities within emergency service agencies. Based on the data that I've collected, this has shown that those working in local units are usually very supportive with regard to the inclusion of people with disabilities in DRR. However, to get internal support and policy on paper to those at the higher echelons, at higher levels, is not necessarily a priority. It's not a priority at those higher levels. Some see people with disabilities as a special group that need to be helped, and some emergency service agencies, however, are trying to change that though. And the fourth one is capacity. The challenges of the level of capacity in supporting people with disabilities in DRR involve funding issues, timing, and insufficient human resources. This impacts how connected or disconnected government, policymakers, and DRR management are on supporting and collaborating with people with disabilities and their needs during disasters. So, what does this mean for deaf communities? I've highlighted 3 key points in regard to in principle and what is being seen in practice. All right, so the first one is to do with policies, UN, national and local disability laws. In principle and practice, these just ensure that everyone has the same and equal access to emergency information. However, it doesn't tell you how accessible this may be for some and not for others. Secondly, it may meet the requirements on providing access to emergency information. In principle, emergency services are supposed to provide accessible emergency information for all. In practice, however, for deaf people, this is only limited to during the actual response to a disaster, where, for example, sign language interpreters and/or captions are provided on television. Thirdly, we look at governments supporting equality. Yes, in principle they do, but in practice, equal access doesn't mean it is equitable for all, for everyone. Emergency information may be available online, but is it accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people who wish to get the information in sign language or captions? And is it accessible for deaf-blind people who need visual descriptions and information that is compatible with screen readers? If they're not, then it's not equitable compared to others who can get the information without any accessibility issues or problems. So now what I'd like to go on to is equality and equity and what they exactly mean. So on the slide, you can see a picture showing the difference between the 2 words. There are 2 trees on the left and right, and people of different heights trying to pick apples from the trees. The people trying to pick the apple from the left tree are standing on boxes, all of the same height. So whilst the apples are provided evenly for everyone, only 1 out of the 3 people can successfully reach the apples, the tall one, obviously. So it means that equalities are really things that are provided, equality is things that are provided through the same process to access resources and opportunities. Now, if you look on the right side, the 3 people picking apples are standing on boxes tailored to their heights that enables them to successfully reach the apple or the tree and the apples. This is seen as equity, where things or services are provided through a fair process or access to opportunities, information and resources are tailored to each person and their needs. So, the emergency response cycle shows 4 different stages: preparedness, response, recovery, and prevention. For the deaf community members who prefer to access emergency information in sign language or via captions, this is only available during the response part. That is 1/4 or 25% of the whole emergency response cycle that's accessible for us, for people like me who are deaf. Another thing to think about is that should deaf community members be limited to just captions only? They can be, but this will limit the information to those that can read and write. And not all deaf and hard of hearing people can benefit from this. And from research, most prefer to get information in their native sign language, Auslan. So this brings up about sign language interpreter provision on television. Is the quality of the interpreter easy to understand? Just because there is an interpreter on TV does not always mean that the interpreter is fully qualified. If deaf and hard of hearing people are not able to understand the interpreter, then access to emergency information is not equitable. Some emergency and disaster management agencies do not always know the difference between a qualified interpreter and one that only has taken one sign language class. So I ask you, is this considered fair? What about accessing emergency preparedness, recovery and prevention information as well? Whilst having an interpreter and captions on television is great, it is really just one small part of the bigger picture. This doesn't give us the skills we need to prepare and recover from disasters. So again, where is the equity part of the equality process for the deaf community members to enable access to emergency information and services? So when you look at equity, it really comes down to what is considered fair. This is an area that many emergency services fail to understand. They fail to understand the equity part of the equality process. Based on the data that I've collected from emergency service agencies, none of them have any disability policy in place that supports people with disabilities and their access needs. And I say again, none of them. Because of this, there are no clear guidelines for emergency service agencies to follow, other than possibly the provision of Auslan interpreters and captioning on TV during the response part. So 2 interesting things come out of this. There are 2 findings. From a top-down perspective of emergency service organisations, some view providing Auslan interpreters and captions as good PR, and it's good PR in the eyes of the media and to satisfy the legal requirements. In other words, ticking the accessibility box, but that's it. And number 2, despite emergency service agencies working with deaf organisations on coordinating Auslan interpreters during their press briefings, not one of them offered the opportunity to invite deaf organisations to participate in their disaster preparedness or response-related activities. So really, all this comes down to disaster justice, which examines the fair treatment of all people affected by natural hazards through the accountability of resource distribution and representation of different voices, and the recognition of different knowledge forms and equitable resilience. For deaf community members to become resilient to disasters, there is a need for all emergency information and services to be accessible for everyone and to meet communication needs. For this to happen, we need to look at accountability. Who is accountable for the equality and equity of people's access to emergency information and services? For disaster justice to be practiced, there is a need to understand distributed justice, which is the actual outcome of resource distribution. And secondly, procedural justice, which is how decisions are made and who gets to make them. It is the power from those involved in procedural justice that determines the distributed justice. So, as I've covered earlier, who gets to decide what access the deaf community gets in the emergency response cycle? Who decides that the deaf community can only access 1/4 of the emergency information comparable to everybody else? It goes to show how exclusionary and disconnected emergency services are with deaf community members. Now, if we look to the future in terms of my research, what I've done is that I've added COVID-19 as another case study, focusing on inequitable access to health information. Secondly, I'm analysing what other possible inequities deaf, hard of hearing and deaf blind people face in accessing public emergency and health information. And thirdly, I'm developing recommendations on sustaining equitable access to emergency and health information to assist strengthen deaf communities' resilience to disasters and pandemics. Thank you. So if people have any questions, I would welcome any questions you have. Remember, I don't bite, so feel free to ask anything. Maybe this is some new information to you, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have in relation to the deaf community or anything else that you'd like to seek further information on. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Leilani. And thanks, Rebecca, as well for interpreting. So yeah, if anyone, as Leilani mentioned, if anyone has any questions, feel free to stick up a little hand emoji and or just pitch in if you want. Dale, go ahead.
Okay, if I may go firstly, Leilani, thank you very much for your presentation. One of the things you could tell the audience is that in the last few months, you were first an intern and you're now a paid staff member of one of the New South Wales emergency service organisations. In that professional role that you now have, can you reflect a little bit on what you're learning by being inside one of those emergency management agencies? So you're kind of an insider, outsider, insider now. How is that helping you advance elements of your PhD? Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for the question, Dale. That is a really good question. So yes, as Dale mentioned, I am working for Fire and Rescue New South Wales as a disability inclusion and engagement officer. When I first started as an intern earlier this year, no, maybe before I got involved, I should start with, before I got involved with that emergency service agency, from the deaf community perspective, what I would have seen is that there were many gaps. I didn't know what was happening on the inside because I was on the outside. However, once I got into the agency, it was a really interesting experience. I saw it in a completely different way. It was a completely different world there. And it became more, and it was actually more complicated than I originally thought. I really don't know where to start in responding to that question. I could jump all over the place in terms of addressing various issues. But I think what bothered me was that people internally didn't really know how to work or assist people with disabilities. They were not familiar with their needs. So people working within there were just really making it up as they went and going with the flow rather than having a planned response. I think the challenge was most of them were not disability aware. They didn't know how appropriately to consult with different disability groups to find out their needs and how to start working with them. And once I started working there, I think that actually allowed them to connect the dots more, and that we did establish some connections. And of course, you need trust first. You can't just jump in and say to them, this is what you need, or hand over these particular things. That just doesn't work. Trust is number one. So I think what they started to realise was that, and step by step, it's a process where you make the connection. Once you make those links, yeah, you start learning about the group with a disability, and then that's helped people within fire and rescue to determine what the gaps are and what resources are required or what services to provide. So yes, I think it has been a really interesting experience.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's been a big learning experience for everyone, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gail and Leilani. Kurt, you've stuck up your hand, you know.
Thanks, James. And thanks, Leilani. That's, yeah, it's going to be an amazing project. So interesting. So I've got one comment really, and then one question. And the comment is just about the different kinds of justice that you were sort of expanding on towards the end of your presentation, particularly where you sort of focused on the distribution and those distributive questions, and also the procedural things. And I guess I always get interested when justice moves across different issues, from disaster justice to spatial justice and climate justice. I guess the bits of that concept that move and the bits that seem to be talked about in one area but not in another. And so if I think about the environment and climate justice discussions, as well as the redistribution and procedure, there's a lot of discussion about, I guess, the injustice of misrecognition and the principle of recognition as a justice principle. And it really feels like that has a lot of applicability to a lot of the problems that you're identifying in the way that things are in the world, and making the world a bit more like it should be. So that's just a comment, and it'd be really fun to maybe swap some readings and have a bit of a discussion about that in the next few weeks. But my question is actually then about the importance of advocacy and support organisations as a kind of, I guess, conduit between the disaster response authorities and the community, that the deaf, hard of hearing and the deafblind communities that you're talking about. And I suppose I just would love to know more about the state of the civil society organisations that are actually working with those communities, and what sort of funding horizons they're working with, whether they're all on really short-term 12-month cycles, or whether there are organisations that have got much more solid bases of, you know, resources. Because it seems, from where you're headed, it seems like those organisations as a kind of conduit, whether we're talking about decision-making and those other issues, are going to be so important. And I'm always looking for good readings on that topic about the role of civil society too. So I'm just curious about what you found helpful, and what the state of play is there.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. I think, yeah, it's very important to discuss the issue with deaf organisations and how they're finding things. They definitely have gaps, and there are varying perspectives on those organisations as well. Deaf organisations or service providers that support deaf, hard of hearing and deaf blind people, they certainly have networks, they have the capacity to do things, but I don't necessarily know that they have the knowledge or skills to respond in a timely way to emergencies. They haven't necessarily had training in that. They haven't really built connections or links with emergency service organisations. So there's certainly gaps there. They might relate to them in some regard, but it's really limited to providing, say, Auslan interpreters on TV. And that's the extent of it. They don't see anything beyond that. So that's a problem. And I think deaf service providers actually recognise that they do need to do more, but I think there's a struggle. They have a struggle. There's a struggle building those connections between those civil society organisations and emergency service organisations. They're obviously busy with supporting clients on an individual basis, and so it's that balance between trying to provide training to emergency service organisations, but also providing services on an individual basis. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Kat. I think Joe had a hand up next.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Alani. Wonderful presentation. I just want to, I guess, elaborate a little bit more on Kurt's point around the issue of justice and what we mean when we take justice and we apply it in these different types of contexts. And particularly what strikes me is that we do need to think about what recognition looks like in this context. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are around the fact that, deaf communities are not homogenous. And that, we are talking about, a lot of different people with a lot of different interests, and whether or not those interests can be aligned when we think about policy responses in this sense. So just some thoughts around the differences within the deaf communities themselves in terms of that issue around justice and recognition. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think unfortunately, most people within the deaf community don't have a huge knowledge of justice. Their understanding is limited. They may know about it, but they don't understand its connection to equality and equity. So yes, they can see that there's processes, but they don't necessarily comprehend disaster justice as a concept. There's some acknowledgement, they know the importance of emergency information, and they know that it isn't provided on an equitable basis to their hearing peers. But a lot of them are similar to people from CALD backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, people that speak different languages. Of course, the deaf community uses Auslan, Australian Sign Language, and so therefore they're similar in that regard to CALD communities. I think many people think that Auslan interpreters on TV was sufficient and people were satisfied with that. And then they started to realise the 4 different stages of the DRR cycle, like I outlined in my presentation. And they realised that they didn't have 100% access, similarly to people that can hear. So I think often Auslan interpreters are seen as the panacea, as the lifesaver for the deaf community. Yes, interpreters are useful, but it doesn't give deaf people skills as to how to prepare, how to recover from an emergency. So it's taken the deaf community quite a while to understand that the justice part of that, and that really the provision at the moment is limited to response only, which in some ways I do understand the disaster justice in some ways is, it is inequitable.
I was just going to ask about
it is inequitable. So I think, there is, I guess it comes down to an understanding that they're missing something, but but it's really about the provision of information so that people are more clear about what it means and how it impacts on their access to emergency information.
Thanks. That was a very interesting question and answer. Blanche, see you got your hand up. Sorry, just super quick, Dale, you had your hand up before. Did you have anything? Or?
I was just going to ask Leilani to extend her description of civil society organisations by referring to the impact the NDIS has had on the funding and advocacy capacity of, for example, deaf organisations. But I think that could be dealt with another time. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. No problem.
Thanks.
So, Blanche, if you want to go next.
Thanks so much, Leilani. This has been, yes, so fabulous to hear from your experience and research. My question is about some of the slower disasters or slow emergencies, the kinds where we don't end up with anyone on TV talking about it at any point. And if you have knowledge about how how deaf people's experiences of those kinds of disasters might be different to the more spectacular kind of fast disasters.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, the interpreter just froze a little bit, but I think what I understand your question is in terms of slow disasters. Can you just tell me exactly what you mean by that? Do we mean emergencies or disasters that are slowly building before they rise to a crescendo and become more extreme? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I guess the classic example I think of is around drought and or perhaps extreme heat rather than, say, bushfires. Although we know that bushfires and cyclones, for example, have long-reaching dimensions, but they also have a really sharp focused event. So yeah, I'm interested in the ones where there's not the sharp, acute disaster that gets all the attention.
Yes, yeah, I certainly agree. I think the problem is that a lot of the deaf community members don't actually understand the connection between, say, climate change and disasters. They understand that there is climate change, but their understanding is very minimal, I would say, and how you need to prepare for that, how it can build up, and the cumulative effect of climate change. That leads to a more extreme disaster at a later point. So they have a bit of a gap in knowledge there. I think so maybe I've got some responsibility in educating them and some accountability for that. But I think often the focus again is on response. It's not focusing on the link between climate change and the responsibility for trying to minimise that or reduce it at least. I think in terms of emergency preparation, I think the information that we have from Australian Emergency Services doesn't really talk much about climate change, for example. It really, like what potentially could happen in the future. I think it's just not sufficiently in depth. So again, there's gaps in that regard as well, but there does need to be more focus on it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope that's answered your question.
Thanks. Thanks for that one. That was a good question. Bob, do you want to jump in there?
Just a quick point. When Blanche mentioned the slow disaster, it suddenly occurred to me that that sounds like COVID. Leilani, you mentioned that you were adding a chapter or have added a chapter on, or a case study on COVID. What may be a bit early, but what have you found relevant to your topic from COVID? It sounds like a really big topic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've really only just started. I'm just at the beginning, But to date, what I've been seeing is the deaf community's response to the virus, you know, since it first started, since the pandemic started in early 2020. I think there are two main findings so far. Firstly, is access to COVID or information about COVID. So of course, there's been interpreters on TV, and I'm sure that people have seen them appearing on a regular basis. And so the deaf community has had more than they have previously had in terms of information about something similar. But also there are gaps, because it's about how the government communicates with, say, service providers. I think that, and say, for example, NDIS service providers or civil society providers, and how they're supported in some situations as well. So I think the NDIS service provision, it's that they're obviously providing services now, and that's been impacted by the pandemic as well. And in terms of services that are provided to clients, whether they be deaf or deafblind or hard of hearing. But we really need to think about how we can support them better during the lockdown, for example. So everything obviously went online, which was good. But again, not everybody had access to the internet, or not everybody necessarily knows how to use technology, particularly, say, deaf-blind people. How's that worked out if they're used to face-to-face services? They were often very isolated, not able to socialise with other people from the target group. So there was a lot of negotiation during the early times of COVID to work out what could be done and what wasn't able to be done. And information was provided to clients, but it was a very challenging time for organisations because they needed to work out how to do it better, how to ensure that business continued even during lockdown. Also, I think in terms of COVID itself, for the deaf community, if they're looking through if they're watching the media, and of course they were doing that regularly, but in New South Wales, there were some issues in terms of the interpreter actually being cut out of the picture. So the interpreter might have been there with the government official, but they were cut out of the picture, so not seen on screen. Now, if you looked at the Northern Territory as well, they don't have any interpreters that work there. So they actually had to fly interpreters in from Queensland or to connect remotely to an interpreter in Queensland. So the interpreter was shown in a small box on the screen. So, and I think these are challenges that were never considered before. It's raised a lot of questions and also demonstrated a lot of gaps and things to be confronted. I think also just one other thing that I'd like to add, just one more addition. I know yesterday in terms of COVID, there was an interpreter on TV, but it's also quite challenging for them as well. The deaf community can be very critical, and sometimes an interpreter, say, might have a particular, maybe have particular coloured skin or a particular coloured top that makes it difficult for them to be seen well. And there's a lot of debate within the deaf community about the provision of interpreters. And like they're often quite critical of reasonably small things about interpreters. And then again, it comes back to whether the interpreter's actually providing real access to information in situations. So there's quite a lot of debate from both sides, from both the deaf community and interpreters about what's appropriate provision.
Yeah, that's something I never even thought of at the end there. That's very interesting. So is there anything else from people in the Zoom? If not, perhaps we can finish there, 7 minutes early, not too bad. I'd just like to once again, thanks to Leilani for a great presentation, and thanks Rebecca for interpreting, and thanks to everyone else for a great little discussion at the end. That was a good way to finish off Thinking Space for the semester, I think. Thanks a lot, everyone.